Welcome, everybody. Thank you for joining us for the third Standards and Regulations track here at the 25th Annual Hemp Industries Association Conference. We have with us Darwin Millard to present ASTM International's D37 Committee on Cannabis, Cannabis Standards, and Hemp. Darwin's a phytocannabinoid extraction specialist in pretty high demand. We're so lucky to have you here, Darwin. Currently a partner with Phytologics, where he works with clients to design and implement cost-effective, built-for-purpose phytocannabinoid processing solutions. Darwin was a part of the team that developed the Dixie Botanicals brand of hemp-based cannabidiol products and has been active in phytocannabinoid policy development since 2013, at the forefront, in fact. He's the former chair of the Hemp Industries Association Phytocannabinoid Advisory Council, an associate partner with the Indian Industrial Hemp Association, and that means as in India, and currently the Industrial Hemp Liaison for ASTM's International's Technical Committee D37 on Cannabis, where he's working to define standards for the global cannabis industry. Thank you so much for being with us, Darwin. Come on over.
Thank you, everyone, and thank you, Joy, so much for having me be a part of the 25 years here of industrial hemp. So just real quick, going over the agenda today, we'll go over an introduction of what the D37 committee is, what our scope is, and how and why that applies to hemp, and also go under the current review of the standards we have under development, as well as a breakdown that obviously there's a lot of excitement about the flowers and resins right now, but the cannabis plant is so much more than this, and needing to make sure that we don't forget about seed and fiber. And then of course a discussion about the potential fiber and seed standards that we're hoping to, with the participation from members such as yourself, help create. And then a call for participation, like I was saying. The ASTM International and the D37 Committee's efforts is 100% volunteer. So without individuals like yourself, the standards development process can't happen. And we'll, of course, end with letting you guys know when our next meeting is, which is open to the public, and give you guys some insight of when our next workshop will be, which is going to be in Rome next year. So, quick review on what is ASTM. So, ASTM used to be the American Society for Testing and Materials, but in 1974, they dropped that long thing and became the acronym ASTM and strapped on the name International because they officially became an International Standards Development Organization. But ASTM is actually the oldest standards development organization in the world. They were created in 1898 to assess issues in the train industry because steel rails at the time were not standardized, so you had different gauges, so trains were falling off the tracks, lots of issues there, so of course there was a need for standardization, and that's where the birth of ASTM came from. Currently, they're having over 148 different committees, and we're talking about everything from most likely standards for the projector that's projecting the image onto the screen right now, to food safety standards for the mints on the tables, and of course lighting standards for everything for the light bulbs above our heads, sorry, and of course the airplanes in the sky. So standards for everything you would consider essentially what you take for granted in the marketplace. These 148 committees have created over 12,700 different standards from the help of 30,000 plus members from 135 countries. And so the interesting or important thing to note about ASTM International and the standards that are created is that when our standards are not laws, these are recommendations, these are guidelines, these are best practices. But when they are referenced by a regulatory agency such as the FDA or another type of government, then they become law. And so ASTM has an interesting relationship with the Standards Council of Canada, in which anytime the ASTM publishes a standard, that standard immediately becomes law in Canada, which is why the D37 is so important, because obviously our neighbor to the north has just legalized all forms of cannabis, so standards are in high demand currently. Another quick breakdown on ASTM. Also in Europe, we're an international organization with over 1,100 technical experts from several different European member states. Our office is currently in Brussels, and as I mentioned, we're having a European workshop next February. It'll be in English. What's the role of ASTM International? What do they do, and how do they actually help with standards? So standards are, think of them as foundational elements that help actually create a competition or a marketplace fit for competition. These are establishing things such as safety and quality and reliability. And they allow an emerging industry such as ourselves to actually become validated, or essentially how do you ensure that regulators don't need to worry about what you guys are doing? Well, standards are what help them become more or less cautious, I guess, of what about your operations are, because you're adhering to standards for seed and fiber-tight cultivars and not having to worry about complicated standards for THC resin cultivars and things like that. So what ASTM helps do is they provide a place for individuals like myself and you guys to actually work together in creating standards. ASTM is a 100% volunteer organization. I'm here on my own dime. I wasn't not paid to come speak on behalf of the ASTM. I'm simply here because I'm an activist, and I'm here to help promote cannabis as a commodity. And so the ASTM, they are a non-for-profit organization which simply provides us with the tools we need to have a dialogue and a place in order to do that, such as the HIA and their lovely membership setting up the Hilton here for us to be able to have this conference. The ASTM and their structure allows us to actually work together and provides physical and digital tools for us to be able to operate within a participatory democracy style framework to create market relevant standards. And of course, this facilitates collaboration, which allows us to create more appropriate standards so that, say, people on the resin side aren't creating such restrictive security standards that individuals on the seed and fiber sides, it makes no sense for them to implement them because they aren't cultivating something that's dangerous or poses any particular risk to public health or environment. Oh, and so without further ado, here's a quick introduction to the D37. Hopefully. Does the video work?
Oh, if you click on that, see, I don't know if there is internet access in this room. Click on it and give it a try. And if you think we have time, I can give you access from my jetpack if you think we have time to do that.
Oh, no worries. It's fine.
You sure?
It was just a brief 2-minute video about the scope of the D37 and kind of why we exist. Oh, no worries. It's fine. I don't believe we have internet access, so so it's just when all of these presentations are published on the ASTM website. So these are public access and available for review later, and all of the links that are on here are live, so you'll be able to see the video, but of course the video is also on the ASTM website.
And if you're an HIA member, we'll make all of the presentations from the conference available to members of the content. Thank you, Darwin.
Yeah, of course. And another thing to keep in mind about the ASTM structure is that it's completely open to the public. You don't actually have to be a paying member to participate in the standards development process. If you want to provide content in regards to seed or fiber or nutritional standards, you can do that simply by looking it up, finding out who the technical contact is, emailing them, and becoming a part of the process. But if you want to vote and actually have a say and actually vote yes or no for a particular thing, that's when you have to become a member. And it's not like some of these other organizations, competitor is the ISO. ISO is a pay-for-play type of organization where it's, I believe, around 25,000 francs per head to participate, which is roughly the same in US dollars, maybe say $20,000 to participate. Whereas the ASTM, you're not paying to participate in the D37. You are paying to help the ASTM facilitate the standards development process. And it's a measly $74 contribution to actually help be a part of the change you want to see in this industry. So we were formed in February of 2017, so we're not even 2 years old yet. We already have over 500 members. We're one of the largest technical committees within the ASTM structure. We're talking even larger than some of the oldest technical committees that have been within the ASTM, such as their steel standards committee. We have more members than that, of course. Why? Because cannabis is exciting. This is new. This is different. It's not an older industry, tried and true, where essentially the problems have been worked out. This industry, of course, has more problems. We have lots of opinion, lots of things to talk about. So this is, of course, an exciting time for any type of developing industry. So our scope is pretty clear. We're to help create the development and maintenance of standards and guidance materials for cannabis and its products and processes. And the work of the committee will be coordinated within not only the ASTM, but also other interested and stakeholder organizations such as the HIA. And we currently have 8 subcommittees. We have our horticulture and agricultural subcommittee for cultivation guidelines. We have quality management systems, laboratories for test methods, which is incredibly important right now when trying to quantify the amount of THC that's actually in either your source materials, your work in progress products, or your finished goods. And then, of course, processing and handling, extraction and refinement techniques. What are the best practices for this? And then security and transportation. Obviously, there are significantly higher security concerns for resin-type products than there are for seeds and fiber. And how do those logistical applications apply to the cannabis plant? And then, of course, personnel training and assessment and safety credentialing. And then terminology, which is one of our best and I guess more vibrant subcommittees with lots of debate in regards to what do we call this plant? Is it marijuana? Is it hemp? Do we call it cannabis? Or what are the various types of extract and different types of fun terminology, things like that. And our latest committee, D3707 on hemp. And actually, myself was just recently appointed the co-chair of this committee. So I've been elevated, I guess, from being the industrial hemp liaison to now having the responsibility of helping co-chair this all-important committee to help create seed and fiber standards. So here's just an assortment of some of the topics right now that the D37 is tackling. Everything from integrated pest management practices for agricultural and commercial cultivation, as well as extraction and product manufacturing practices, such as how do we apply or harmonize good manufacturing practices, and of course personnel training, and so many different topics that it's a little hard to mention all of them in one go. So just a quick shout out to all of the collaborative efforts that we've been getting from different organizations. We're working with Focus, as well as APA, and the Americans for Safe Access, and then of course the Hemp Industries Association here in the United States, the Indian Industrial Hemp Association, our partners in Asia, as well as our counterparts in Europe and in Canada. All of these groups, of course, are working together to help us create these market-relevant standards, because we can't create standards within a vacuum. If we do that, say, just creating the standards that are appropriate for the United States, then we're losing track of how do these standards affect rural farmers in South Africa? How are they able to compete against major hemp fiber manufacturers such as Hemp Flax out of France, when they are trying to sell the same type of product, whether it's a technical or a textile fiber. So in the ASTM, again, this is a volunteer process, so be a part of the effort, help us, join the D37, be a part of the change, because as I said before, there are, out of the 500 plus some odd members, 95% of those are screaming about resins every day. And so we need to make sure we don't lose track of seed and fiber, which is of course a 40-plus-year-old established industry within, I guess, modern sense of time, but is a centuries-old industry that could be commoditized today, essentially kind of more or less low-hanging fruit standards that would help establish the cannabis industry as something more than just a prohibition-based economy. Our next workshop is going to be in Rome on the 18th and 19th, immediately following the Canapa Mundi Cannabis Lifestyle Fair, which is the largest cannabis event in the world with over 30,000 participants. We hope that we'll see maybe a couple of you there. And our next committee meeting is going to be in Houston on January 27th and 29th. Where you can actually come and participate in the standards development process. Again, as I was saying, you don't have to be a paying member to participate, but if you want to actually raise your hand and start a motion and all of those types of things, that's when it becomes important to be a paying member. But if you want to come and essentially commingle with your peers and other technical advisors who are pushing and helping create these standards, that part is completely open. So within the last year, we were able to approve our first two standards. Yay! These two standards are specifically for safety and quality of the flower material, establishing a water activity level for flowers intended for human consumption. So now, if you're going into a dispensary, I don't know how many of you also consume cannabis, or marijuana in this case, right? When you're going into a store, the quality of that may be questionable. Well, now we have a standard that says as long as it's within these levels, you can at least know that the cannabinoid content is going to be maintained, and that product is going to have at least a shelf life long enough for it to be on that shelf for you to come in and buy it. First, you don't have to worry about it being of a degrading between when they packaged it and when you actually come and buy it. So our newest subcommittee, D3707 on hemp, was established to develop standards for the characterization and uses of hemp for the applications and its derived products such as, but not limited to, of course, food, natural health products, animal feed, and non-consumable products such as concrete and other building materials and technical fibers such as like. And some of the two major first working groups that we're going to be establishing will be going into non-viable seed and construction materials. So all the fun standards for seeds such as grading, classification, specifications of seed for pressing and for are they appropriate for shelling or hulling, that type of thing. And then of course structural equivalency standards for concrete, or essentially comparing concrete to hempcrete so that when building contractors are flipping through their materials lists and they can see the various types of concrete that they could potentially use on their project, they see hempcrete and notice it's slightly more expensive than the other materials, but it has all of these other various beneficial applications, so they end up using it. And of course, test methods plaguing the industry right now. As I'm sure you guys are aware, not too many people are willing to believe some of the test methods that are, or the data that's out there. And you can have variances of plus or minus 20% of a reported value, which is pretty much unheard of when you have other established industries. So when you go and say you buy your Coca-Cola or a soft drink or something else from the vending machine, you're not worried about is that batch of Coca-Cola expired and going to potentially cause you a health harm. But as a consumer within the cannabis space, you essentially have to do the due diligence of a federal agency and a regulatory body because you can't guarantee that those products that were manufactured at a high enough quality for them to actually be safe to consume, which shouldn't be the responsibility of the consumer to have to take on. So of course, test methods are some of the major standards that we're currently working on right now. Everything from quantifying the amount of THC and CBD in the product to, of course, establishing microbial limits and heavy metals, pesticides, and other microbial contaminants. So quick going into these are the actual 2 standards that we have published. As I was saying, they're specifically related to water activity. And so water activity is similar to water content, but it's also significantly different. So water activity represents the amount of free water that's available for microbial growth, whereas water content is the measure of both bound and free water. So the argument there being that the bound water is not available for microbial growth and therefore should not be considered or included in the calculation for the amount of water in the material. So this standard specifically looks at the amount of free water, and it could be think of it as the relative humidity of the plant material. So the jar or the container that it's supposed to be kept in should be around 55 to 65% humidity to prevent microbial growth. But this also helps maintain product quality. And so the 2 standards work together. One is there to establish the limits or the range for product quality, and the other is to help you determine that product quality, to determine that water activity level. These 2 standards help working together to provide retailers of flower products to be able to maintain product quality, such as for yourselves who are selling CBD flowers, who might be looking at potentially selling smoking cessation products, such as CBD cigarettes and other things like that, which are all the rage right now in Switzerland. This would allow you a standard for quality of those particular types of CBD flowers. So here right now is a list of some of the current working items that we are developing under the D37. Some of these particular items have been starred so that I could remember to say something about them. But mainly thing is that my job as the liaison for industrial hemp to the D37 is to be a fact check or a double check to make sure that we haven't written standards to be so general that they apply to seed and fiber producers and cultivators, or haven't written them so specific that they are essentially preventing other manufacturers from being able to utilize that standard and be compliant. Before, representatives like Joy were being willing to help the HIA or the ASTM and myself on the D37, I was essentially out there alone. But now I have more people to help us to go through the various different types of standards when they're talking about CAPA, so corrective action and preventative actions for cannabis products. We can make sure that that was written to actually be talking about cannabis products. All types of cannabis products, resin, nutrition, fiber-type based products, and multi-purpose, and not being specific to resin-based products, so THC or CBD, CBN, all of the phytocannabinoids. So helping structure the actual standards themselves to apply more generally or more broad across all spectrums of the cannabis space. So here's a couple of the standards that we've been working on. You can see the 2 highlighted ones are the ones that we've recently created. But there are a couple other ones here that are starred here in regards to, say, labeling and packaging of cannabis products. So this particular standard in general, what came up, and the author of this had great intentions. But of course, as you can see with the title of it, it's Standard Practice for the Labeling of Packaged Cannabis Products for Wholesale Distribution. So the way that it's titled blatantly implies that it's talking about all types of cannabis products. But in fact, the author was only talking about resin cannabis products. So flowers, extracts, oils, things like that. So going through the drafting process and helping them with the standards development, it is now a standard practice for labeling of packaged resin cannabis products. And we may even change that again to be talking about THC resin cannabis products. That's kind of still up to debate and how all of these standards evolve over time. Yes.
Being the first line of defense for all of this at that international level is so important to us, Darwin. Thank you so much.
Sure, I appreciate that. There almost every negative or almost every standard so far I've voted no on because of something as simple as like with this one here, just not throwing the word resin right in front of cannabis products there, something as simple as that. But there are various different types of negatives. There are technical changes and editorial changes. Lots of editorial changes happen all the time. They make the standards better. Technical changes, of course, actually affect the content of the standard and how they function. So those take a little bit more time to work out than saying you should have, say, added a comma here, or I'd like to add a word. Which is, of course, now we're finally coming down to the cannabis plant is obviously much more than just flowers and resins. We have seed and fiber and established commodity markets now that are essentially being thrown aside and that need help from stakeholders such as yourselves to establish them in the 21st century. So how does ASTM and the standards apply to cannabis? So right here on the left, you have a list of standards, everything in which the ASTM is involved in. And as you can see, cannabis applies to almost every single one of these different types of, or these different markets, except potentially maybe mining and mineral processing. And you could actually probably throw it into energy and utilities if you were talking about using it for ethanol production, for fuel ethanol, or even biofuel manufacturing if you're going to take seed oil, which is actually one of the most efficient bioavailable oils to convert into biodiesel. It's a 1-to-1 conversion ratio. So as you can see, ASTM is incredibly relevant to the various different market aspects of the cannabis plant. So, standardizing the cannabis plant. How can we help reduce regulatory burden and actually promote a real commodity market for cannabis? We can do that by modernizing how we actually talk about this plant. We're a new industry, and from that but we don't have to go this alone, which is the lucky thing. We have a structure or a skeleton in which we can use other standards organizations like ISO and ASTM to help us essentially connect all of the organs and pieces, so to speak, to our skeleton. And luckily we have industry professionals within the ASTM who have helped other new and fledgling industries go through this entire process. So we don't have to do this alone or recreate the wheel. There are easy standards for us to be able to port from other industries in, such as construction materials like particle board, that would allow us to easily reference those and just simply make it now apply to cannabis as well, so that we can start making construction materials and getting those products out there, instead of just trying to scream every day that these hemp-based particle boards are so much more efficient with energy costs or antimicrobial or antifungal, all these things that we know, but the consumer base just doesn't have a way of validating. Standards give us, or at least get us one step closer to that. So obviously, these are the main 6 types of standards that ASTM creates. We have terminology, classifications, specifications, test methods, guides, and practices. Terminology is pretty easy, but again, like I was saying before, it's one of the most vibrant subcommittees that we have in discussions. So is it cannabis? Is it hemp? Do we want to use the word marijuana in any of our literature? All of these things are vibrant debates because, of course, we have, as a 500-member base, everyone has major opinions about different things, about how we want, what types of terms to use. So terminology is a very important thing to discuss. Then, of course, classifications, so types of seed and fiber and resin. Specifications such as quantifying the aesthetics or olfactory responses of a type of product, or the THC content or contaminant limits. And then essentially test methods for validating those specifications. So if, say, you've got grade A seed, well, what makes it grade A seed? What are the various metrics that define it as that? And then how can you confirm that it's actually grade A seed? I want 100,000 metric tons of grade A seed so I can press it into grade A seed oil. And you get your certificate of analysis. But who tested that? Against what? What are those things? That's what we're creating here with these standards. And then, of course, guides and practices for those things. So practices are just like GMP, best practices, right? For cultivation and processing and safety and handling, all of these various things, we have to establish the best practices for that. And then guides that help you assimilate to these best practices. So for fiber itself, here's a quick example that gives you a good picture of where we need standards, such as dry versus wet decortication. Which method is better? Which method is better for what types of products? Well, the only way to establish that is by creating the standards. Obviously, these are two very different types of processes. Retting and dry decortication essentially is done by leaving the plant material out on the field. It gets wet, or it's either wettened by the rain, or you're putting an accelerant on it. Sometimes you're usually just spraying it with water, and the natural bacteria on the soil is going to break down the bast fiber so they are actually easier removed, and then from there you've now got your material that is then dried and decorticated. And essentially you're breaking up the material, right, and there's lots of loss that can occur during that process. And now the newer process methods that allow you to actually decorticate wet and fresh, so you can actually harvest these stalks and decorticate them immediately. But now you're dealing with, all right, now I've got wet and gummy, stringy, fibrous material. How do I dry that in the same manner that allows me to use it as the retted material that was dried and then decorticated? And then how do you equate those two once you've established those two products? So you've got a practice for doing dry and a practice for doing wet decortication, and then specifications for establishing that if you did one way or the other, you make the same product, so that, say again, farmers, rural farmers in India or Africa who only know how to or can do this by hand have a way of doing it and competing against Canadian farmers, U.S. farmers, and European farmers that have more established mechanized approaches to harvesting.
So should I buy a wet or a dry decorticated alum?
Well, wet decortication hasn't been validated yet, but it's currently being done. So just to kind of dive into kind of the nuances of what we're actually talking about here for fiber specifically in terminology. Are we using hurd? Are we using bast? Are we going to talk about retting? What does decortication mean? These are simple terms but have to be defined for our industry to actually grow. And then I was saying, as I was saying before, classifications such as textile or technical fibers. What's the difference? How do you actually define what is a technical or a textile fiber? And that's essentially where the specifications come into play, and test methods as well. How are we doing on time, Joy? So I need to speed up. So this is a quick example of commoditization of industrial products, how standards could essentially modernize the cannabis plant and the various completely legal and above ground products that could be that are established and only need defined standards to create a competition essentially within the marketplace. So when it comes to seed standards, what's important to everybody right now? Well, some of the major ones, of course, is THC content and food. This has been a big debate now for the last several years. There are different, each country seems to has its own opinion on how much THC can be allowed in food. And soon, we're going to have our own opinions about how much CBD can be allowed in food. And so, if that's where standards development and your voices can be critical, because you can help create the standards or help do the study, help fund the analysis to determine what is the appropriate limit for THC in any type of food product, or the upper limit of CBD before it becomes a pharmaceutical good and squarely in their realm, but below that we should be able to do whatever we want because it's an over-the-counter good or a dietary supplement or whatever we want to define it as. So these limits of whether it's 5 parts per million, 1 part per million, 10 parts per million really don't matter until we've harmonized them internationally. And that's where standards development can come into play so that European farmers can compete against Chinese farmers who can compete against South African and South American and U.S. and Canadian farmers. And we're all competing at the same level for our hemp seed oil and establishing one specific standard that can be sold throughout the international marketplace. And you'll see here maybe a blast from the past, the test pledge certification emblem there. An interesting study, which will be available if you guys want to read it, is the Nova Institute's report on THC limits and their recommendations. The Nova Institute is a international, They're a German-based international natural products organization, and they do research on behalf of the European Industrial Hemp Association. They're kind of like their research partner, and they have provided these recommendations based on various different types of food products. And they have also produced a guideline on their recommendations for CBD as well. So again, kind of getting into the weeds, so to speak, in regards to the standards that can be applied to seeds. Of course, terminology such as threshing and chaff and grain and hemp seed versus hemp seed. Which way would we like to see that word going forward? And as I've already alluded to before, grades of seed. Is grades of seed the appropriate way to think about it? Maybe it's not. And so helping us define these things is what we need participants such as yourselves over the next year and the coming years to establish market relevant standards from which you can be happy with to build the cannabis industry going forward. Again, standards that you can see would help rapidly commoditize natural food products within the international marketplace, all of which are within the wheelhouse of ASTM and are in development. And so again, participation, of course, is key. I'm a volunteer. All of this doesn't happen unless yourselves actually want to make a change. And so I highly recommend that if you guys are at all in a stakeholder or an advocate for cannabis, to participate in the standards development process and to help us create the future you want to see. And I'll just leave that here with our next meeting being in January, and then we have our workshop in Italy during February of next year. 2 opportunities for you guys to be able to get a chance to see me again and a whole bunch of other people in Q1. And then we have 2 meetings biannual, one in Q1 and one Q3. So I think the next one, it's either going to be in Asia or Canada. Haven't confirmed yet. But either way, it's going to be a fun time, guys. So we'll see you there. Yes, sir.
So it sounds like the standard's going to be very dynamic, especially over the next couple of years. Like, what's the best way that I could be updated on the changing standards?
Participate.
Yeah.
So that's great. We are in the process of establishing our LinkedIn page, so you'll be able to find the D37 LinkedIn page and be kept appraised of where everybody's going to be, what conferences we'll be at, so that you can talk to more people. All of the presentations will be up there as well. Information about what standards we're currently working on, and of course information back to the website so that you can get connected if you'd like to join. So we're getting more and more aggressive with social media and getting the word out.
So you don't have like some kind of subscription model?
I mean, you mean like a blog or a news?
Yeah.
So if you're a member, then you get that all the time. But if you're not, then you would be relying on our social media webcasts and everything like that. Yes, and then.
So there were only 2 standards that were approved.
Uh-huh.
One was like the relative humidity, but then for like the water activity, do you measure that with like what tool? Is that a density meter? Is there something you measure?
Sure. So there are water activity meters. Yeah, and that you can use. There are different types of ones depending on how you would prep the sample. And again, the 2 standards are what the range of water activity is for product quality, and then the other is how to control that range. So if once you've determined it, then you can use either glycerin or salt-based sachets to help control that humidity. And yes?
Yeah, so it looks like it seems like there's a discrepancy between how hemp is being defined in D37 and how it's being defined in these emerging laws in various countries, where these laws are defining it by Thc content, and here we're defining it by application.
Yep.
With resin type, and we have hemp is going to be.
Yep. Yeah, we don't look at cannabinoid content at all. We completely define everything based on fit for purpose. So why are you cultivating? Why are you processing? Those are the standards you follow. So we haven't defined anything based on cannabinoid content, and we did that on purpose.
Yeah. Do you expect this is going to be any kind of confusion or
So the way I like to frame that is, we are forward thinking, and of course there's an uphill battle based on education that we have to do. But I think the situation where a police officer who doesn't know the difference between 99.9999% pure CBD from a THC cultivar and comparing that between 99 point however many nines CBD from a low THC resin cultivar, what the difference between those two are when they both look like cocaine or crystal meth. All that police officer cares about is that that product looks dangerous and you're going to go to jail until they can test that what you said is what it is.
You mean the officer isn't going to look up the D37 standard?
Exactly. So, I mean, exactly. So, for us, it's easier to help reframe the structure of the debate, and instead of trying to keep raising the THC level every year, because obviously we want to produce more resins, right? To just cultivate or manufacture towards the appropriate resin standards. And so we have a strong debate going on right now between THC resin cultivars and high THC and low THC to make the distinction between those two, because there is a perceived, I guess it's safer. CBD is not as high a risk as THC is. And so as of right now, we have kind of have to structure and work ourselves within that. But potentially, if you guys are not aware, at the end of this year, the WHO is making their arguments towards the UN Narcotics Commission about removing the cannabis plant and all of its resins from the Controlled Substances Act, or the single convention, more appropriately internationally. And they will also be, the UN Narcotics Commission will also be making an official scheduling of the CBD molecule on the single convention, which is amazing. They'll probably follow the DEA here and make it Schedule 5, but there's still some chance that they're going to remove it completely from the single convention. But anyways, over the next year or two, and hopefully no later than 2020, the UN is going to make their announcement on this rescheduling of the cannabis plant and resins completely. So the one thing about ASTM that I'll leave you guys with is that we don't have static standards. So once we create a standard, say tomorrow it's determined that THC isn't scary, we're removing it from the Controlled Substances Act, and now there's no danger with anything, then we can eliminate the kind of the overburdensome regulations that are in place now by updating our standards tomorrow, if that was, say, the situation. Whereas ISO is a 10-year gap between when they can make an update. So if ISO were to establish standards, say, today for cannabis, which they are, they wouldn't be able to update those until 10 years from now, even if we as a people in a society have evolved past that and have said, say, removed all cannabis resins from the Controlled Substances Act. They would be stagnant in their standard structure until, say, 2030.